The golden age of Hollywood wasn't just about glamour, stardom, and silver screen magic. Behind the velvet curtains and studio lot gates, some of the era's most shocking secrets involved forbidden relationships that violated not just social taboos, but the most fundamental boundaries of family itself. These weren't rumors whispered in gossip columns or scandals splashed across tabloids. These were truths so disturbing that studios, fixers, and powerful executives worked tirelessly to bury them forever. From silent film stars to golden age icons, the entertainment industry harbored dark secrets involving incestuous relationships that would only come to light decades later, long after the perpetrators had been celebrated as legends. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on 10 of old Hollywood's most disturbing incest scandals that the industry desperately wanted you to never know about. What you're about to hear will forever change how you view some of cinema's most revered names. Scandal 1: Charlie Chaplin and Lita Grey. Charlie Chaplin, the beloved little tramp of silent cinema, harbored a deeply troubling pattern of pursuing underage girls throughout his career. His relationship with Lita Grey began when she was just 12 years old, and he was 35, hiring her for small roles in his films. By the time she turned 15, Chaplin had impregnated her, forcing a secret marriage in Mexico to avoid statutory rape charges. But the scandal goes deeper. Lita later claimed in divorce proceedings that Chaplin had made inappropriate advances toward her when she was still a child, essentially grooming her from childhood. Their divorce in 1927 became one of Hollywood's first major scandals, with Lita's 50-page complaint detailing disturbing sexual demands and psychological abuse. The court sealed many documents for decades, and studio fixers worked to suppress the most damaging allegations. Chaplin's reputation somehow survived, protected by his immense popularity and the studio system's machinery. The full extent of his predatory behavior toward multiple young girls, some barely teenagers, wouldn't be fully acknowledged until long after his death, when historians could finally examine the sealed records and testimonies that painted a picture of systematic exploitation hidden behind his comedic genius. Scandal 2: The Barrymore Family Secret. The legendary Barrymore acting dynasty, John, Ethel, and Lionel, represented American theatrical royalty, but their family tree concealed a disturbing secret that wouldn't surface until decades after their deaths. John Barrymore, considered one of the greatest actors of his generation, allegedly engaged in an inappropriate relationship with his own niece, Diana Barrymore, according to claims that emerged in biographies written in the 1970s and 1980s. Diana, who struggled with alcoholism and wrote candidly about her troubled life, made veiled references to abuse by a family member in her memoir. Later, biographers and family members suggested that John's alcoholism and erratic behavior in his later years was connected to guilt over boundary violations within the family. The Barrymore family's public image as America's theatrical royalty made any investigation impossible during their lifetimes, and the studio system protected their legacy fiercely. MGM and other studios had too much invested in the Barrymore brand to allow such allegations to surface. Diana's own descent into alcoholism and her tragic early death at 38 was later understood by some researchers as potentially connected to childhood trauma. The full truth remains obscured by time and the family's determination to protect their theatrical legacy, but enough evidence has emerged to suggest that the dynasty's internal dysfunction went far beyond the alcoholism and eccentricity they were known for. Scandal 3: Errol Flynn's allegations. Errol Flynn, Hollywood's swashbuckling heartthrob known for playing Robin Hood and other adventure heroes, faced statutory rape charges in 1942 involving two underage girls. While he was acquitted, largely due to his charismatic courtroom presence and expensive legal team, darker allegations emerged decades later. Flynn's own autobiography, published posthumously, contained troubling passages about his sexual exploits that his publishers heavily edited. In the 1980s, when unedited versions and Flynn's personal papers became available to researchers, shocking claims surfaced about his relationship with his adopted daughter. Multiple sources, including people who worked in Flynn's household, alleged that Flynn had engaged in inappropriate conduct with the girl he'd adopted, blurring the lines between paternal care and exploitation. The studio system had protected Flynn throughout the 1942 trial, with Warner Brothers spending enormous sums on his defense and managing press coverage. His acquittal became famous for originating the phrase, "in like Flynn," celebrating his escape from justice. But those who knew Flynn personally, including several of his wives and companions, later spoke about his predatory nature and complete lack of boundaries. The adoption itself was questioned by investigators who wondered about Flynn's true motives. But by the time these allegations became public, Flynn had been dead for decades, leaving behind only fragments of testimony and suspicion. Scandal 4. The Talmage Sisters. Cover-up. Norma and Constance Talmage were among silent film's biggest stars, beautiful sisters who commanded enormous salaries and wielded significant power in 1920s Hollywood. Their mother, Peg Talmage, was a notorious stage mother who managed their careers with an iron fist. In the 1990s, when film historians gained access to private letters and studio documents from the era, disturbing patterns emerged. Multiple sources suggested that Peg Talmage had facilitated inappropriate relationships between her daughters and powerful male relatives, including an uncle who served as their business manager. The arrangement allegedly involved the uncle having intimate relationships with both sisters, sanctioned by their mother as a way to keep business affairs within the family. Contemporary observers noted the unusual living arrangements and the uncle's unprecedented control over the sisters' finances and personal lives, but no one dared speak openly during the sisters' lifetimes. Joseph Schenck, who married Norma Talmage, allegedly discovered the situation and was reportedly disgusted, though he remained silent to protect his wife's reputation. The studio system, particularly United Artists, where the Talmages were major stars, ensured complete silence on the matter. When sound films arrived and the sisters' careers ended, they retreated into complete privacy, refusing all interviews. The few people who attempted to write honestly about their lives faced legal threats. Only after all parties were deceased did researchers piece together evidence from letters, diaries, and testimony from former household staff. Scandal 5. Wallace Reid's Family Nightmare. Wallace Reid was one of silent cinema's most popular leading men, known for playing wholesome American heroes. His death from morphine addiction in 1923 shocked the nation and led to Hollywood's first major drug scandal. But investigators and studio fixers who dealt with Reid's affairs discovered something far more disturbing than drug addiction. Private documents, finally unsealed in the 1970s, revealed that Reid's addiction began after he suffered injuries on a film set, but intensified dramatically due to psychological trauma from his family situation. Multiple sources, including his widow Dorothy Davenport's private papers, suggested that Reid had been sexually abused by a male family member during his youth, and that this relative continued to exert control over him into adulthood. More disturbingly, there were allegations that this same relative had attempted to gain access to Reid's own children. Reid's drug use was allegedly his way of coping with the guilt and trauma of being unable to protect himself or his family. Paramount Pictures, which had Reid under contract, moved quickly to suppress any investigation into his family background, fearing it would tarnish not just Reid's memory but the entire industry. The studio crafted a narrative of Reid as a tragic victim of Hollywood's grueling work schedule and unscrupulous drug dealers. Davenport spent the rest of her life crusading against drug use in Hollywood, but she never spoke publicly about the deeper family trauma, though her private writings make clear she knew the full story. Scandal 6. John Huston's Dark Secret. John Huston, the legendary director of The Maltese Falcon, The Treasure of the Sierra Madre, and countless other classics, lived a life of creative brilliance shadowed by personal darkness. In 1933, when Huston was 26 and still years away from directing his first film, he struck and killed a female pedestrian while driving drunk. The incident was quickly buried by studio connections, with Huston never facing serious consequences. But decades later, in the 1990s, Huston's daughter Angelica made cryptic statements in interviews about her father's inappropriate behavior toward her during her teenage years. Other family members and biographers pieced together a disturbing picture of boundary violations within the Huston household. Angelica's brother Danny Huston later acknowledged in interviews that their father's treatment of Angelica had been complicated and troubling, though he declined to elaborate. Colleagues who worked with Huston noticed his disturbing habit of making sexual comments about his daughter and his inappropriate physical affection toward her during her adolescence. The director's legendary womanizing and multiple marriages took on a darker context when examined alongside these allegations. After Huston's death in 1987, several of his former wives and companions suggested that his relationship with Angelica crossed lines that shouldn't have been crossed, though legal threats from the Huston estate prevented explicit publication of these claims. The Hollywood establishment, which had celebrated Huston as one of cinema's great artists, showed little interest in examining the darker aspects of his personal life. Scandal 7. Mary Astor's Diary. Mary Astor was a major star from the silent era through the 1940s, winning an Oscar for The Great Lie. In 1936, she became embroiled in one of Hollywood's most sensational custody battles when her ex-husband threatened to release portions of her diary that detailed her numerous affairs with Hollywood's elite. The diary excerpts that made it into newspapers scandalized the nation with their frank sexual content. But what the public never saw were the portions of the diary that remained sealed by court order for decades. When researchers finally gained access to the complete diary in the 1980s, they discovered passages describing inappropriate contact by a male family member during Astor's childhood and teenage years, when she was being pushed into films by her domineering parents. The diary also revealed that Astor's own father had exhibited disturbing possessiveness and jealousy regarding her relationships with men, behavior that crossed into emotional incest. Her parents had essentially sold her into the film industry at age 14 and exercised complete control over her earnings and personal life well into her 20s. The diary suggested that this control included monitoring her physical development and her interactions with male co-stars in ways that were deeply inappropriate. MGM and other studios moved quickly to ensure these passages never became public, recognizing they would cast a disturbing light on the industry's exploitation of child actors. Astor herself fought to keep these sections sealed, presumably out of shame and a desire to protect what remained of her family relationships. Scandal 8. The sinister side of Roscoe Arbuckle's trials. Roscoe "Fatty" Arbuckle's 1921–1922 trials for the death of actress Virginia Rappe destroyed his career and became Hollywood's first major scandal, even though he was eventually acquitted. The official story focused on a wild party, alcohol, and a tragic accident. But investigators at the time discovered evidence of a much darker undercurrent that studios and powerful figures worked desperately to suppress. Witnesses testified about seeing Arbuckle with his young niece at parties in ways that made them uncomfortable, and allegations surfaced that Arbuckle had been sexually abused as a child by male relatives, setting off a cycle of dysfunction. More disturbingly, testimony that was stricken from the record and sealed for decades suggested that Rappe herself had attended the party to confront Arbuckle about his relationship with a young female relative. This alternative narrative explained why the party turned violent and why Rappe ended up in a locked room with Arbuckle. Studios, particularly Paramount, which had Arbuckle under contract, couldn't allow this narrative to emerge because it would have implicated other powerful figures and revealed the extent to which the industry enabled predatory behavior. The prosecutor in the case later admitted privately that he'd been pressured to avoid certain lines of questioning that might have exposed a wider network of abuse. Arbuckle's acquittal didn't restore his career because too many people knew the unsealed truth, making him too controversial to employ despite his legal innocence. Scandal 9. Clara Bow's tragic background. Clara Bow, the original It Girl and biggest female star of the late 1920s, captivated audiences with her vibrant energy and natural screen presence. But her life story, when examined closely, reveals a heartbreaking pattern of abuse that the studio system exploited while simultaneously covering up. Bow's mother suffered from severe mental illness and had attempted to kill Clara multiple times during her childhood. Her father was largely absent, and Clara was raised in extreme poverty in Brooklyn. What emerged in biographies written after Bow's death was evidence that Clara had been sexually abused by multiple male relatives and family friends during her childhood, with her unstable mother unable or unwilling to protect her. When Bow won a fan magazine beauty contest and came to Hollywood at 17, she was already traumatized and vulnerable. Studios, particularly Paramount, recognized her star quality, but also her psychological fragility. Rather than providing support, they exploited her need for validation and her confusion about appropriate boundaries. Several of Paramount's executives and producers engaged in sexual relationships with the teenage star, relationships that would today be recognized as exploitation of a trauma victim. Bow's well-publicized romantic scandals in the late 1920s, affairs with multiple actors, and engagement to a man who tried to blackmail her, were symptoms of her early trauma. When she suffered a nervous breakdown in 1931 and retired from films at just 26, the studio released a statement about her high-strung nature without acknowledging their role in her deterioration. Scandal 10. The suppressed truth about Joan Crawford. Joan Crawford built one of Hollywood's most successful careers, reigning as a major star from the 1920s through the 1960s. Her 1978 death was followed a year later by her daughter Christina's explosive memoir Mommy Dearest, which accused Crawford of being a violently abusive mother. The book focused on physical and emotional abuse, but hinted at something darker that Christina seemed reluctant to fully articulate. In interviews conducted in the 1990s and early 2000s, Christina made more explicit statements about inappropriate boundary violations and sexual abuse within the Crawford household, though she continued to speak in careful legal language. Other adopted children from the era came forward with similar stories about Crawford's circle in Hollywood, describing a culture where the adoption of children was sometimes motivated by deeply inappropriate desires. Investigators who looked into Hollywood's adoption practices during the 1940s and 1950s found troubling patterns, with some stars adopting children through questionable channels with minimal oversight. Crawford's case was particularly disturbing because her fame and power made her essentially untouchable. Warner Brothers and other studios where she worked had protected her reputation fiercely during her career, and even after Mommy Dearest was published, many in Hollywood rallied to Crawford's defense, dismissing Christina's claims as the bitter rantings of a disinherited child. Only as more victims of childhood sexual abuse began speaking publicly in the 1990s and 2000s did Christina's carefully worded allegations begin to be taken seriously, revealing that Crawford's legacy was far darker than anyone had acknowledged. The scandals we've uncovered today represent only a fraction of the darkness that lurked behind Hollywood's golden facade. These weren't simply moral failings or lapses in judgment. They were systematic violations enabled by an industry that valued profit and image over human dignity and justice. The studio system's fixers, the complicit press, and a culture of silence allowed predators to operate with impunity for decades, leaving countless victims without recourse or recognition. While we can never undo the harm caused, acknowledging these hidden histories is essential to understanding how power and celebrity can corrupt, and how institutions can fail the most vulnerable. Today's Hollywood still grapples with issues of abuse and exploitation, as the Me Too movement has revealed, but at least we're beginning to speak truth to power. The golden age of Hollywood produced magnificent art and unforgettable performances, but we must remember that this brilliance came at a terrible human cost. If you found this video eye-opening, please subscribe to Golden Era History for more untold stories from cinema's past. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and remember, the truth, however uncomfortable, deserves to be told.